autonomous activity that does not start from his ego, but starts from the dark sphere. These interpretations would have a profound and lasting effect on Beckett, but none more so than Jung's assertion that there are certain people who suffer from the fact that they have never been really born. Beckett would continue to identify with this diagnosis, until finally it became an integral element of his most profound work. Beckett later remarked, "I hated London." He felt alienated and alone. His accent marked him out as an Irishman, and consequent prejudice, while he found himself unable to relate to English literary acquaintances. Eventually, after 2 bad years, he decided it was time to pull the plug on London. He returned to Ireland to live with his mother, who, ironically, had been one of the main reasons for him going into psychoanalysis. Their relationship was too close and too difficult. Her overbearing character and utter disregard for his ambitions to become a writer left him exhausted and bewildered, yet unable, finally, to break free. In between times, Beckett continued writing poetry and short stories. In 1933, his book of short stories entitled More Pricks Than Kicks was accepted by a London publisher. This book consisted of a number of linked stories featuring Belacqua, the hero of his abandoned novel. My sometime friend Belacqua enlivened the last phase of his solipsism before he towed the line and began to relish the world with the belief that the best thing he had to do was to move constantly from place to place. He did not know how this conclusion had been gained, but that it was not thanks to his preferring one place to another, he felt sure. A year later, a friend in Paris offered to publish his collection of poems, Echoes, Bones, and Other Precipitates, as long as Beckett contributed toward the cost. The title poem in its entirety runs, "Asylum under my tread all this day, their muffled revels as the flesh falls, breaking without fear or favour wind, the cantaloupe of sense and nonsense run, taken by the maggots for what they are." Such poetry, published in a small limited edition in English in Paris, attracted little attention. Beckett was now almost 30, and still having to live off his wits and his small private income. He settled down to have another go at writing a novel. Between writing and rewriting, this would take him 3 years to complete, finally being accepted by a London publisher in 1937. This is, recognisably, Beckett's first accomplished post-apprentice work. The author's need to inflict his great erudition upon the reader is restrained to the point where the proceedings remain more or less comprehensible. The bleak, self-defensive humour comes into its own, and the result is a work by turns farcical and philosophical. Surely the work of a truly oblique and original mind beginning to express itself with a measure of confidence rather than arrogance. Its opening words set the tone. The sun shone, having no alternative, on the nothing new. Murphy sat out of it, as though he were free, in a mew in West Brompton. Here, for what might have been 6 months, he had eaten, drunk, slept, and put his clothes on and off, in a medium-sized cage of northwestern aspect, commanding an unbroken view of medium-sized cages of southeastern aspect. Murphy is an impecunious Irish intellectual, driven to misanthropic despair as he seeks some form of spiritual relief from the world around him. We see him sitting in his room, naked and bound to a rocking-chair. Only the most local movements were possible. Sweat poured off him, tightening the thongs. The breath was not perceptible. The eyes, cold and unwavering as a gull's, stared up. Murphy subjected himself to this ordeal because it gave him pleasure. First it gave his body pleasure, it appeased his body. Then it set him free in his mind, for it was not until his body was appeased that he could come alive in his mind. Murphy has affinities with many of Beckett's favourite thinkers. Like Descartes, thinking is his proof to himself of his existence, and his philosophy leads him to believe that his mind is separate from his body. He is possessed by a Schopenhauerian pessimism and views the world as a veil of maya. And besides witty echoes of various philosophers, there are also direct references to Jung. Murphy's mind pictured itself as a large, hollow sphere, hermetically closed to the universe without. This was not an impoverishment, for it excluded nothing that it did not itself contain. Nothing ever had been, was, or would be in the universe outside it, but was already present as virtual or virtual rising into actual, or actual falling into virtual in the universe inside it. Despite his solipsistic inclinations, Murphy cannot avoid becoming embroiled in the outside world. In the course of the novel we meet the prostitute Celia, who is Murphy's sole support, until he ends up in an asylum called the Magdalen Mental Mercy Seat. Here he continues his search for nirvana, rocking in his chair, until someone inadvertently pulls the wrong chain in the lavatory, releasing gas into his room where there is a lighted candle. After the fatal explosion, we learn of Murphy's will. With regard to the disposal of these, my body, mind, and soul, I desire that they be burnt and placed in a paper bag. His ashes are then to be taken to the Abbey Theatre in Dublin, where they are to be tipped down the lavatory. And I desire that the chain be there pulled upon them, if possible, during the performance. Unfortunately, the man chosen to execute this task, his friend Cooper, gets drunk in a bar and ends up angrily throwing the paper bag containing Murphy's ashes at a man who had given him great offence. The bag bursts, scattering the ashes. By closing time, the body, mind, and soul of Murphy were freely distributed over the floor of the saloon, and before another day spring greyoned, the earth had been swept away with the sand, the beer, the butts, the glass, the matches, the spits, the vomit. Unsurprisingly, the publication of such an oddity passed all but unnoticed in literary London. But the little attention it did eventually attract was significant. Dylan Thomas wrote an unfavourable review, but declared, "Murphy is the individual ostrich in the mass-produced desert," characterizing Beckett's humour as Freudian Blarney, Sodom and Begorra. Later, the young Anglo-Irish Iris Murdoch, more than a decade before she became a writer, found a deep rapport with Murphy's Irishness and originality. Later still, an unread copy was borrowed from a public library by the penniless actor Harold Pinter, who was so overwhelmed that he decided to steal it. Meanwhile, Beckett's life in Ireland was going from bad to worse. He was still living at home, but spent the afternoons and evenings wandering the pubs of Dublin. Mornings consisted of hangovers and motherly reprimands. He began to develop psychosomatic illnesses, suffering particularly from scrofulous rashes, anal cysts, and boils. By the autumn of 1937, illness-inflicted abstinence allowed him to pay off his accumulated pub debts, and he had enough money to travel again. He set off for Paris, determined that this time he would stay away as long as he could. Unfortunately, he was called back to Dublin to appear in a libel case, which one of his drinking companions had taken against the writer Oliver St. John Gogarty. Loyally, Beckett returned, but his public appearance in court proved traumatic. Squirming in the limelight of the witness box, Beckett was forced to endure a humiliating vilification of his character by Gogarty's counsel. Adopting an air of bluff puritanical philistinism, the lawyer mercilessly played to the gallery. Beckett was dismissed as a pretentious intellectual, the writer of a pornographic poem, by the title of Horoscope with a capital W prefixed. Next day, a report in the Irish Times referred to Beckett as the bored and blasphemer from Paris. He didn't dare go home and face his mother. This time Beckett left Ireland, swearing never to return. Back in Paris, he found himself unable to concentrate on serious writing, and was pleased to take on occasional literary hack work for extra funds. Word that he had now published a novel began to spread among his friends. He made contact with James Joyce, and through other friends was invited to one of the wild parties thrown by the American heiress Peggy Guggenheim, who was in Paris buying up modern art for her London gallery. Guggenheim described Beckett as a tall, lanky Irishman of about 30, with enormous green eyes that never looked at you. He wore spectacles and always seemed to be far away solving some intellectual problem. He spoke very seldom and never said anything stupid. He was excessively polite, but rather awkward. He dressed badly in tight-fitting French clothes, and had no vanity about his appearance. Guggenheim soon fell in love with Beckett. and they began an on-and-off affair that would last many months. But in the end, the vivacious, socializing Guggenheim, who collected famous names as much as she collected paintings, and the elusive misanthropic Beckett proved incompatible, and they went their separate ways. Decades later, in her autobiography,